I'm Pennylyn Dykstra-Pruim. I'm the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion here at Calvin University. And I am here with my lovely colleague, Kait Chau. We are both affiliated with the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship, and they're one of the kind of sponsoring partners for this event, along with the Center for Intercultural Student Development, CISD, and the Provost Office. So welcome. We are here to talk about Asians and Asian Americans, Info and Insights, which is kind of a generic title, but we're going to tell you exactly what we're going to do in a minute. I just want to let Kait introduce himself if he'd like.
My name is Kait Chau. I am a staff member. I'm a resource developer for the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship. And in my role, I do editing work for Reform Worship, a journal published by the CRC denominational office. I also help out at the Calvin Seminary for the chapel. And in my spare time, I also teach a couple of courses at Calvin, mostly around the worship and world culture course, which has been fun. It's a course going on right now. So having students to think about worship and worship practices and world culture. How do we share similarities at the same time, a lot of differences? So some of the presentation content are coming out of that course and expand on that course as well.
Can I also use this other mic so we don't have to go back and forth? Is that okay? All right, that'll be good. Oh. Oops. All right. So I promised I'd tell you what you're in for today, because the title is a little generic. Today we're going to do these learning points, hopefully. By the end of the day, the end of our little session. You won't be here all day, I promise. Hopefully, you'll have a few facts about Asian, what that means, and how to think about it, and particularly about Asians and Asian Americans at Calvin University. We'll have a little bit of a little interactive thing, a little quiz on Asian and USA majority culture communication styles. And we'll conclude that little section with some insights and tips and strategies for you going out. It's a super shallow touch on this because of our time frame, but it gives you an idea and a starting point. Then we're going to look at Hofstede's 6 dimensions. If that's not something you're familiar with, it's okay. It's an introduction to a way of thinking about and comparing and contrasting national cultures and understanding how Asians, broadly termed, can be perhaps, look, there's a word missing. Guess you'll have to wait. Can be understood a little bit better with this tool. And then the last thing we want to mention is a little bit more about diversity and inclusion at Calvin University, some clubs and organizational kinds of resources for you as you head out and the rest of your week. Oh, thanks. So it's my job to do this beginning half. And what I want to do first is just a little fact check on what Asia actually means. So if you Google this and look around, Asia actually refers to over 50 different countries. And you can see the map here, and they do talk about these parts of Asia, like North Asia, right, which could be Russia and some of the stands, West Asia, which is more what we might think of as the Middle East, Central Asia, which would be in the middle of this map, East Asia, you can guess what that is, more like Japan and Korea, and then South Asia, which is perhaps India, and a couple stands there, and then Southeast Asia, which is sort of Thailand, Indonesia, right? So it's a lot of different countries. It's a huge area of the world, and it can be, depending how you want to count it, like half the world's population, right? Just China alone is a lot of the world's population. Okay, next slide. So to think a little bit about Asia at Calvin, our international Asian students, you can see here kind of our list, are about 63% of our total international students, right? If we think of Asia as this broader kind of Asia, right? And that's another thing I think we need to think about. When we talk about Asians or Asian Americans, often when we talk about Asians, especially in the American context, it's actually way more than just Chinese people, right? It's maybe any of those 50 countries that we were just looking at. It's, all the way from like the Middle East through over to Indonesia, India, all the stands, even parts of Russia, and then China, and the ones that we might more easily think of, China, Hong Kong, Japan, Taiwan, maybe Singapore. Okay, next slide. So this is also the reported demographics from the Day 10 report. So some of you may know, Calvin does this Day 10 census, where Day 10, that's where we count how many students are here, and we have some data about them. So this is the reported racial demographics for our students of color. And this, I believe, though I could not get confirmation, I think this is just domestic students of color. Okay, so this is differentiated from the international group, which we just looked at. Okay, so the international students as a total right now, for including our Day 10 data, is about 8% of our student body, and 63% of that 8%, so like way over half, are Asian. Okay, but this says there's 16.5% of our students are domestic students of color. They identify that way. And if you look here, 5.3% of this number would identify as Asian, but it is unclear to me how many in the multiracial line might also partly identify as Asian, because that was not factored out, right? So my children, if they were to fill that out, they would probably click on multiracial, and I would love to see us be able to say, click all that apply. But that would make the statistics really difficult, apparently. I don't know. But I feel that way too. And I think like on the most recent census, you could actually click all that apply, right? So I'd like actually to see Calvin do that too. Next slide. All right, so this is something else I'd just like to announce. There's a terminology change at Calvin. So if you've been here for a minute, you might have heard the term AHANA to refer to our domestic students of color. And that acronym, I hope I get this right, it's African American, Hispanic, Asian American, and Native American, AHANA, right? That was our acronym for domestic students of color. But now, if you click, we are changing, you can click again, to BIPOC. This is a term that has gained sort of some footing, I would say, over the last 3 years, and it stands for Black, Indigenous, and persons or people of color. And I can say that as an Asian American, when I first heard this, I'm like, what? Where am I in there? Right? But I really, through conversations and just learning with others and unlearning, and like my great colleague here, Eric Washington, just really helped me to think about this too. This is just, it's not saying that certain persons of color are more valuable than others, but it's recognizing the kind of unique group experiences that were particularly traumatic and need to be recognized of both our Black, not primarily African American, but other Black identifying people as well, and our Indigenous citizens, right? And they have unique group experiences that were particularly traumatic. Now, I could do a completely different presentation on some of the traumatic things that have happened to Asians in our history, our country's history, and they are significant as well. But I, as an Asian American, am embracing the term BIPOC because I do recognize that there's just a very different kind of genocide and slavery and things that have happened to the Black and Indigenous populations in our country's history. And BIPOC kind of says, you know what, we just need to recognize that. And then we want to say that all people of color also share certain experiences. So we have this new term, BIPOC. But anyway, the Calvin Intercultural Student Development Office is, Jane, this is correct, right? We're switching over now to use BIPOC for our domestic students of color. Yeah. Okay, so out with AHANA and in with BIPOC, just letting you know. Okay, next slide. All right, yes, thank you. So my little tool that I want to give you is some ways to think about communication and conflict across cultural lines, especially across the Asian and US majority cultural line, right? So this is where you either have to be able to remember 4 numbers, or you might want a little piece of paper, scrap paper, and a pen, or you could write on your hand, you can wash it off later, because I'm gonna ask you to write down 4 numbers. I'm gonna ask you 4 questions and ask you to write down 4 numbers, and then afterwards we're gonna unpack it a little bit. So you might wanna know what number you chose to remember, right, as we're unpacking it a little bit. So there'll be 4 questions. You write down 1 number for each question, and then you can look at it later. So like I said, if you have a pen or a piece of scrap paper or a notes thing on your phone app, awesome. All right, first slide. So this is the first question. On a scale from 0 but this isn't the first question, this is the overview. For each of these things, on a scale from 7 to 1, you're going to rate yourself. What is your preferred communication or conflict style? And we're going to look at these 4 different types of ways of negotiating with people. We're going to look at context, which is like a sociolinguistic word. Don't get hung up on it. Low and high, I'll explain that in a minute. Then B is pretty intuitive, like people go, oh yeah, some people are really direct communicators and some are more indirect. That's the second one. The third one is instrumental versus expressive. So that's a little more like, are you emotionally expressive or more restrained in how you do that? And then the fourth one we'll look at is formal and informal, which is also pretty intuitive, right? People can imagine what that would mean in terms of communication if you're more formal or you're more, laid back and oh, whatever. All right, so we're going to look at each of those. The first one, this is the first number you have to write down. On the scale from 7 to 1, are you more this one? I believe people should be clear in exchanging facts and information. Or are you more at this end? I believe people shouldn't have to discuss everything explicitly. A lot of information is understood from the context. So just for yourself, what is your thinking? What is your preference? Where are you comfortable in terms of communication and conflict? Are you more, things should be clear, lay it out, man? Or you should not have to explicitly lay out everything. We understand each other. All right, so write down a number. This is your first number. You could put A and then the number 7 through 1 that fits you best. All right, everyone write down one number? All right, next one. This is B. So this is, are you more direct or indirect? What is your preference? What is your comfort zone? Are you on this end? I prefer explicit one- or two-way communication, including identification, diagnosis, and management of conflict. Or are you more at this end? I prefer implicit, intuitive communication, and I avoid conflict or direct confrontation. All right, so choose your number. You can write B, and then choose your number 7 to 1 on what is your preference. What do you tend to do? Are you direct, let's get it out, let's air our issues, or are you more I'm going to avoid that conflict? All right. C, are you more instrumental or more expressive? So on one end, we have, I value unemotional, impersonal communication styles. Objectivity is good. Or are you over here? I value emotional, personal communication styles. Subjectivity makes the message real. So we've tried to phrase both ends in a positive, right? But from either end, you might look at the other one in a negative way. It depends where you are. So where are you on this scale between 7 and 1? Write down your number. And then we only have one more question. Then the hard work for the session is all done. All right, D, formal versus informal. So at that end, it is important to follow protocol and social customs. Showing respect in how we speak is valued. Or are you more on this end? One can easily dispense with ceremony and rigid protocol. A casual style seems personable. So write down your fourth number. Now we're going to unpack it a little bit. You've got 4 numbers, and we'll review them. And then with each one, we're going to show you a little bit what the experts say, different areas of the world or different cultures in the world would be on these scales. And in particular, we're going to focus in on what they say about Asians and how that compares to what we might see about US American majority culture. Okay? So let's take a look. We're going to combine these two, A and B. A, if you remember, was this low-high contexting, which means you have to be really explicit about everything, or you can just kind of go with it and understand a lot from the context. And then B was direct or indirect. So we're kind of combining these two because they tend, almost always, not in every case, but they tend to be similar in terms of national cultures and tendencies. So let's see the answers. This is based on the Cultural Intelligence Center work. They've done a lot of work and research to make these conclusions, and they group the countries this way, and they say, okay, Arab, Confucian Asian, Southern Asian, Sub-Saharan Africa, they tend to do this more. They tend to be high context, which means there's a lot of stuff I can get from the context. I don't need to say it all explicitly. And then they tend to prefer implicit intuitive communication and avoid conflict or direct communication. Okay, now I want to make a little distinction here. Confucian Asia, according to the Cultural Intelligence Center, is China, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, and Korea, probably South Korea, but Korea, right? And then they would say Southern Asia is sort of really more Southern Eastern Asia, all right? So Indonesia, Malaysia, India, they would put in that certain group. Now I look at that and go, oh my goodness, Confucian Asia, if you lump China, Korea, Singapore, Japan, and Taiwan into a group, there's already so much diversity there. How can you do that, right? Especially like China and Japan strike me as so different in terms of communication styles and culture and language, but they did it, okay? So I'm just gonna put that out there. I'm not exactly completely happy with that, but okay. At least they didn't say just one Asia, right? Which we know is like 50 countries and maybe 60% of the population of the world. Okay. But as you can see, here is the Asia stuff, and then over here is Anglo, which is what they would say the USA majority culture is, way at the other end. Okay, so think about that. If this is our majority culture, and it's a majority university kind of culture as well, we want to be clear. We want to exchange facts. We don't want to rely on the context to understand stuff. We prefer one-way, direct communication, identification, diagnosis, management, hands-on with our words, right? We're at this end. And if you come from this other culture, you're going to feel maybe a little uncomfortable in some situations, right? It's going to take some training or adjustment or code switching, which might be a term some of you are familiar with, to be able to function well in that other culture. Okay? Let's go on to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind. All right, and you're at the same time thinking, what numbers did I do? Where am I on the scale, right? All right, so this was the instrumental versus expressive, sort of how kind of emotional, how much emotion do you let into your conversations with other people and into your conflict resolution, verbal conflict resolution. So what does the Cultural Intelligence Center say? They put the countries in this order. So here you see Confucian Asia, value unemotional and personal communication styles, objectivity is good. But Southern Asia, they put a little more this direction, more emotion, right? And where is Anglo? In the middle. And you're kind of thinking, where am I? What number did I write, right? What am I more like? And for some of us who might be on this end, when we have to do this all the time, it gets really tiring. And it feels like you're not being real. Like, you're not really telling me what you think. You're just being Michigan nice or something, right? Or you're being, like, super heady and intellectual about it and not, you're using your head and not your heart. That can feel that way, right, from this perspective. At the same time, people over here, looking over there, those people are thinking, why are you so emotional? Like, just think it through. It's totally logical. And get rid of the tears. That is not helping our situation here. Right? That is not helping us think through this problem. Right? But if you're used to one or the other, right, you can see how it can be hard if this is your operating system to always have to be here or to have to be here predominantly at a university situation. And if this is where you come from, it can be hard to understand how the value of this other way of communicating and negotiating conflict. Right? Okay, and you're all thinking, what number did I write? Where am I on this scale? Right? How comfortable do I feel? Where and when? Maybe I should move to Latin America. All right, next slide. All right, this is the last one. So formal versus informal. And we want to see what the Cultural Intelligence Center said. All right, so they said, Confucian Asia, again, that's China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, is in the middle. That's what the Cultural Intelligence Center said. And they said, Southern Asia is more over here. And I don't agree with them completely, because I think in particular Japan is more over here. Okay? Anyway, and they say Anglos are way on that end. So the United States majority culture, according to the Cultural Intelligence Center, generally says one can easily dispense with ceremony and rigid protocol. A casual style seems personable. All right? So again, if you're thinking, what did I write down? If you are from Asian culture or background, it could be that this feels disrespectful, right? You want me to call my professor John? Whew, like that just, and this happens too, it happens in our classrooms and our students. So I'm just gonna tell a quick story. This is also in a book I wrote, so sorry if you heard it before. I took a group of students. We used to have a January term where we did a lot of traveling. And I took a group of students to Cambodia, which is Southeast Asia. And in the group, we had 3 professors from Calvin and, 30 students. And we basically said, we are totally comfortable if you call us Penny and Len and David, right? And some of the students had no problem with this and thought it was nice. A few of the students kind of like, but they all got used to it, right? Then we're in Cambodia, and we're interacting with locals who are helping us in our team. And there's a recent graduate there, native of Cambodia, but he spent time in America, and he knows American culture very well. And I said to this student, who was older than my students, right, because he'd already graduated and was working with the NGO there, I said, oh, call me Penny. But I noticed in the time that he was just having such a hard time, like he would avoid calling me my name with all these like, excuse me, yes, like he was doing all these things to avoid saying Penny, right? And it's not because he didn't know up here about American culture or that Americans do this. It's that he was, and just it felt so disrespectful, like he couldn't get himself to do it. So this is what we did finally in the end. I noticed something like, oh, I'm so sorry, like, what can we, how can we get through this? He's like, well, could I call you Aunt Penny? So in Cambodian, there's this term, I think it's Bon, but I don't speak Cambodian. But there's this little term you can put in front of females, right? That kind of means auntie. But it doesn't have to be like really your dad's sister, right? But it's this way to kind of show respect to someone older, but still a familiarity, but it didn't feel like just calling them Penny. So as soon as we figured this out together, we were like, okay, students, Calvin students, from now on, we are Aunt Penny and Uncle Lynn and Uncle David, because it just sounded so much better to the people who were hosting us, right? Even if they know up here, Americans just do that because they're all casual and loosey-goosey. Because you're coming out of this other culture, the more formal, it just feels like, oh, I can't do it. They're so disrespectful, and you can't help it. It's like how you feel down inside, right? It takes a lot of unlearning or a lot of time with feet in 2 cultures to be able to really feel both equally, right? So it's our job as people, as we go out into the world, to learn and unlearn the right things, to be able to recognize things like this and then find the good compromise when it comes to communication and conflict styles. Okay, all right, next slide. All right, so here's just a little summary. The red circles are where the experts say Americans are or Anglos. And the green circles, now the Cultural Intelligence Center divided Asian into 2 categories, and they were sometimes a little different. But in general, the green circles kind of represent where many, not all, but many Asian cultures might circle on these same 4, questions. And so you can kind of see, what numbers did I write down? Where am I on this? So you can see in some instances, we're not so far away maybe, but in other instances, we're actually very far away. And this is just like a little appetizer. If you really want to dig into it, there's just lots of literature and TED Talks and stuff about it. But this is just a little appetizer to think, I maybe need to be aware of this. Now, what do we do with this information? I'm going to give you a couple tips before I'm done. I'm going to hand it off to Kait in a minute. But the next slide, I think, is the one that gives us some tips. Let's see. Yes. So here's a couple tips for us with this little bit of information about communication styles. Integrate a variety of ways to give feedback, answer questions, and make suggestions. This is especially for the teachers and educators and communicators among us, but also students, you have the opportunity to do this kind of thing and carve spaces where you're leading or facilitating conversations. So can you include opportunities for both direct and indirect input communications questioning, right? So that could be, does anyone have any questions? Your professor asks at the end of the hour, right? And some people are like, oh yeah, and other people are like, wouldn't do that, right? So can you integrate some indirect ways? Can you hand out cards and have anybody who wants to write down something and hand those in, and then those questions or things are the first thing you do the next period, but they're anonymous and more indirect, right? Can you have some sort of virtual question board that people can then post to? Because for some people too, that feel, even if their name is attached, it feels less direct than raising their hand and saying, I don't understand something, because that can feel like being disrespectful to the professor or the authority in the classroom. Can you do both identified and anonymous kinds of input or questioning, right? Same idea. Spontaneous, a lot of us do a lot of spontaneous stuff, like the professor will just say, you know, what do you think about question A? Or what do you think about this? Or what would you do? And then kind of waits for some, you know, the eager-eyed bunny tail, whatever the phrase is, to raise their hand, or the one who always answers the questions, right? But can we do some combination of that spontaneous stuff and the in advance planned and assigned stuff? Because some people communicate differently and have different preferences, right? And feel much more comfortable if they can plan what they're going to say. And then both a combination of written and spoken. This can also be true for some of our students for whom English is not a first language, that sometimes it's easier for them to do something in writing in advance and have a little prep time than it can be easier to do that than to speak spontaneously, or they're just more likely to do it. Even if they could speak spontaneously perfectly fine, they're just a little less likely to do that. So can we just make sure to integrate both and, right, in different ways throughout the course, maybe on a day, but certainly in the course of a week or a semester. All right. So here's the communication styles kind of takeaways. It's not always clear-cut, but there are some helpful cultural generalizations, like some of the things we looked at, that we can use and research and get to learn about that will help us predict a little bit where trouble areas might be and set us up for success. We need to think cross-culturally and strategically about our communication and not just go with the flow all the time if we want maximum number of people in a more diverse audience or room or class or church to feel comfortable and a sense of belonging, right? That this is their place too. And we can do that if we think a little bit more about our communication and conflict styles. Then head versus heart, I mentioned that example, right? Where it's not that some of our international or other culture people aren't smart or don't understand American majority culture. And it's not that they shouldn't maybe learn some strategies for dealing with and understanding and interpreting majority culture. You can know it all up here, but you can just always feel a little bit different if it's not your home comfort ways of communicating and you're forced to be there all the time, right? So another way of creating belonging and inclusion is to become more aware of the different communication strategies and preferences in the room, and then try to create our spaces in ways that recognize those differences. And the last thing here is it is on the majority culture people, and I would say I'm one of those people too, and I'm a professor, I have that status. It's on me to do some adapting, right? The people in my classroom, for example, who are from they're adapting all the time. They're adapting 24/7. They are tired, potentially. And so it's on me to set up things in my classroom where I have control, right? Where I'm a guide of some sort. It's on me to do the learning, to figure out what's going to help most people feel comfortable at least some of the time, right? And just be aware of those things. So. Hand it off.
All right, thank you. Penny, or Auntie Penny. So we looked at communication style, right? How people communicate, or preferences for communication. So in the next several minutes, we're going to look at a more broad level, culture in general, national cultures in general. sometimes when we talk with particularly younger people, when we see people that behave, act a little bit differently than our own, we just say that, he or she is just weird, right? Weird is a general catch-all term that those people behave differently than myself. The good thing about this study is to give us proper vocabulary to talk about culture. In fact, the study of world culture is does not have a very long history. So I want to give you a little bit of a historic background on how this comes along and what kind of terminologies that we have come up with so far. So we have to mention somebody named Geert Hofstede. But actually, I find his name weird, right? Because it's not a usual name that I encounter every day. And I like to be respectful. I want to pronounce the name properly. So I actually look up on YouTube, on wherever, how to pronounce his name. And guess what? The 10 places I look at, I heard at least like 7, 8 different pronunciations. They are so different that you can't even recognize that he's referring to the same person. So I'm going to settle on pronouncing his name as Geert Hofstede. That doesn't mean that I'm correct, but at least I tried. And that is the spirit of intercultural communication, right? We may not be correct all the times, but at least we try. The more we try, the bigger the possibility that we have better communication. So Geert Hofstede is a Dutch social psychologist. He has his awakening, so-called awakening, when he traveled from the Netherlands to the UK. And he thought, well, we are all European. We are all white people, right? So we should behave and think quite similarly. But in fact, he found out that no, that's not the case. How Dutch people think is very different from how the British people think and act. So that was his awakening in this whole idea of there may be something called national culture. And later he became a HR researcher at IBM. So his job brought him around the world, talking with people, helping people to cooperate, work together. IBM is a multinational company. How can he help people to work together more efficiently or effectively? And then he noticed that from different cultures, there's some general trend, because we all have our different personalities. So we cannot say that all Asians would behave that way, all African people would behave that way. That's not true. But in general, like what we saw earlier from the Cultural Intelligence Center, there could be some generalization about people from different culture and how do they behave. So in the late 60s to the early 80s, he spent a lot of effort to collect a humongous amount of data and try to figure out what is going on. So next slide, please. So he published a book in the 80s called The Culture's Consequences, Comparing Values, Behavior, Institutions, and Organizations Across Nations. That was in 1980. And then in 2001, not that long ago, 20 years ago, and there's a revised edition to that. So out of his research, he noticed that there are several elements that can be used to describe how different nations, people from different nations behave or think. Next slide, please. Okay, so you will see here there are 6 dimensions. We call it a 6D model, all right? In the early part of his research, he focused on the first 4, and the other 2, the bottom 2 elements are added on after other researchers questioned his research and expanded his research, and a lot of discussion going on. So now we have the 6D model. And then we still call it, even though it's not completely Hofstede's work, but we still call it Hofstede's 6D model. So this is how it goes. He looks at the difference in power distance, the perception of power. By definition, power distance is for those who do not have that kind of power when they look at people have more power, how do they feel? So a very simple example is if you're a student, so you have less power in that social structure than a professor, instructor. How do you see that inequality in power? Do you think that, well, guess what? We are all people. We are here in the same institution. We may have a different role, but we are here together, learn and grow at the same time. So that may reflect that you have a low power distance perception. But for some students, they think that professors should be high up in the pedestal, or actually they're actually at the front, right? Speaking to us students, and professors need to be respected at all times. They cannot be wrong. If they are wrong, they should not be standing there and teaching us, right? And we have to treat the professors with respect. In a church setting, that's the same case. If you are looking at a pastor, would you call him or her reverend last name? Because you feel that a pastor is so much higher up than the general congregation. Or you feel like we are all brothers and sisters in Christ. And this pastor has a calling to lead us. So we are actually on the same journey. We're on the same boat, right? And then we're just helping each other. And he is gifted differently than me, okay? But we are going down this path together. So it depends on how we view. So high power distance and low power distance. How we perceive power difference, okay? The second element is called individualism to collectivism. Now, let me put my little bit of personal view here. In a lot of literature, you will see that is actually in the graphics there, individualism versus collectivism, right? I personally don't quite like using the term versus. It seems like there are two extremes, and we are always competing and conflicting with each other. And in fact, this is like a continuum, all right? It is not an all or none. Either you are all individualism or all collectivism. That is not true. So it is a spectrum. You may be leaning towards the individualism side or leaning towards more the collectivism side or somewhere along the spectrum. Like we practiced earlier, 7 to 1. Doesn't mean that you're either 7 or 1. It could be somewhere along the way. So individualism versus collectivism basically means that how do you see your role, how important yourself is, okay? And individualistic people will look at, I am very important. I have to take responsibility. I have a major role in whatever life situation. I need to be responsible, okay? I need to be independent. Collectivistic society looks at it a little bit differently. They look at it as a group. How can we do better? How can we improve? How can we together in a better place? So the term that we use instead of independent, we use interdependent. When we think about your career at Calvin, what major do you choose? You think about your gift, your aspiration for your future, right? What kind of work, what line of work you want to get into? How many of you think about your family? I came from a family of this particular vocation. Or if I choose that major, will my parents be happy? If I choose that major, will I bring honor to my family or not? Okay, so for me, as a music major in a Confucian Asian culture, I had a major issue with my family because choosing a music major is how can you live as a musician? No musicians can live, or either you live like a hippies, all right? So the mind is you either live like a hippies or you just starve to death, all right? So when I choose my career, I was very concerned about my parents' thought, feelings. And I felt that I was doing some like major decision that is not honoring my parents' wish. And I felt bad for a long time. So that's part of my collectivistic background and how I think about making choices. So individualism to collectivism, we're looking at independent or interdependent. We see ourselves or our group. The third one, well, terminologies are changing, so we want to introduce some newer terminology in there as well. In Hofstede's research, he used the term masculinity and femininity. Masculinity is how a society views success, strength, personal perseverance. They value this kind of accomplishment. A more feminine society will look at how do we care for each other. How are we concerned about the nurturing of a person? So instead of how many certificates you can put on the wall, and I want to see how much a better person you are after you finish the education, right? So that masculinity versus femininity value. And, but we all understand that it is a stereotyping to think that, male is more muscular, and then a female tends to be more like caring. So that is a stereotyping in practice. And that's why you see the terminology is changing. So we call it a society that values strength versus a society that values caring. Okay, same idea. The fourth one is what we call uncertainty avoidance. It's a double negative, so be very careful when you think about that. Uncertainty avoidance is how much do you want to avoid uncertainty? So that means how much do you want certainty in life? In some societies, they do not want to have uncertainties. All right? Everything is like an engineered work. Everything is well structured. They valued well-structured program, well-structured events. And some other communities, they don't need to plan that much. Everything like, let's get together, have a good time. Whatever pops up, somebody wants to bring a song, do it. Somebody wants to dance, lead us dance, do it. Whatever food that you bring, we'll enjoy it. We don't have a specific agenda, all right? Think about worship. Sometimes we think that, these are more liturgical, older type of service, or we call it traditional service. They are very planned, right? You have a bulletin, you have all the liturgy, all the sequences that listed. So you think that they might be a type of community that valued certainty. And then the so-called more contemporary worship services, they're more free, like you go in and then it starts at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, you sing a few songs and then the pastor come preach and then you go with a blessing, right? It's less structured. That's what we think. But is that true or not? It depends on who you talk with, right? If you are part of the worship planning community, guess what? For a contemporary worship planning, we use software or apps like Planning Center Online, and every element in the worship covers up to the second, okay? This song is 2 minutes and 15 seconds long, and then there will be a greeting for 35 seconds, and then there's a prayer. There's a prayer that will go on for about 1 minute and 35 seconds, and then we'll do something, all right? So even though on the outside it looks very casual, all right, I remember when I went to a more contemporary church, and I thought that they're less structured. And then guess what I saw? On the PowerPoint slide, beautiful picture being displayed before the beginning of the service. And then on the bottom right-hand corner of that PowerPoint slide, there is a clock counting down to 10 o'clock, all right? So 5 seconds before 10 o'clock, the worship leaders walk up to the platform, to the stage, and right at 10 o'clock, and then here the drum comes in, right? So it might look not very structured, but it could be very structured. But anyway, in the cultural viewpoint, we are looking at this element of uncertainty avoidance, high uncertainty avoidance. We want to avoid uncertainty at a high level. That means we want structure, we want prediction, we want control. If you are low on uncertainty avoidance, that means you can live with uncertainty. Anything goes. Let's come together at 10 o'clock at my house and then we have a party. then anything goes. Whatever we enjoy the food or activities together. And then later on, Hofstede's research got expanded. 2 more elements was put into the elements. So one is called long-term orientation compared to short-term orientation. Long-term orientation is a culture that values planning for the future. The society in general believes that the world is changing all the times. So what we do now, we want to plan and get ready for the future. Okay? So we are planting seeds for different things happening in the long run. If you are leaning towards the short-term orientation, you're looking at now and more emphasis in the past as well. Philosophically, these communities believe that whatever happened in the past is building what we have today. And we should do things according to what the previous people has done for us. Think about values, all right? You may come from a community that we constantly talk about, hey, Confucius taught us this, and thereby we should live like this today. Whatever happened that 1,000, 3,000 years ago, we better do it because that's the value that we carry. This is what we are concerned about. How do we live now? While some other culture would say, whatever we do now contribute to the next few generations. Let's get a foundation for them, and let's have a longer-term view of life, of our world. All right? Now, this particular terminology is also changing. In the business world, we look at, we use the term pragmatic versus normative. For a long-term oriented culture, they're looking at more pragmatic. For a short-term oriented culture, they'll be more like normative. How do we live today? All right? And then in the academic world, there is a set of terms that comes up quite recently. We use the term monumentalism and flex humility or flexibility. How flexible you are, or how do you see that this monument, this is the standard of life that we want to practice. All right? The last category is called indulgence compared to restraint. Are you in a more indulgence culture? We have an accomplishment. Let's go celebrate. Let's go enjoy. So we all go out to a restaurant, and then we eat together. We have fun. We laugh and eat and drink. We all enjoyed it. Okay? And then from a different culture, a more restrained culture, people would generally think, this is what you should do anyway. Right? This is what we should do. That's our responsibility. And then why celebrate? That's part of your job. And then you did it. Okay? Whatever you do, contribute to the future success of the project. All right? So let me tell you a story from a very Asian family. So let's look at this grades from school. A, B, C, D. We had an E before we had an F, so it's a little bit different, but similar idea. And my mom, let's say, when I got a B minus, all right, and my mom was not very happy. I was quite happy, but she was not. She said, what? You got a B minus? How far off are you from a C? All right? How far off are you from a C? Well, not far. All right, so work harder. Okay, that's my upbringing. When I got older, I was brave enough to talk back, which is a no-no, right? Power distance. Mom is there. I am here. Talking bad is bad. But I was old enough to be brave, to talk back. One day I asked my mom, you always said that if I got a B minus, it's close to a C. You never said to me that if I got a B plus, it's very close to an A. Why? Well, I didn't use that kind of. Why? Why would you do that? Not why. Right? Why would you do that? And that was her response. I'm saying that to you because I want to encourage you to do better. I don't want you to fall to a lower grade, right? That's why I don't say that, when you get a B+, you're closer to an A, so let's celebrate. So you can tell that I am from not a very celebrative culture, not an indulgence culture, very, very restrained, very restrained. I don't know about you. What do you do? Like when you get a B-, what did you think? When you get a B+, what do you think? That's a reflection of that kind of cultural setting. And then with all these terminologies, okay, don't think that I am from a more restrained culture. For those people who always go out and celebrate, always bring food, and always have a good time, and I'm a quiet person, and those people are just weird, right? So instead of saying that they're all weird, actually I have a terminology to describe them. They may be in a more celebrative, more indulgence culture, all right? Now, going back to this Asian cultural characteristics, how do we describe Asian culture? Auntie Penny said earlier that because there are 50 countries, we cannot generalize all these countries, all these people in the same category. So I kind of did some very quick kind of random choices, pulling up several countries, and let's look at how these countries, how the people from these countries tend towards in terms of this 6-dimensional cultural value. So the next slide, I just pull these random so that we can see that how different we can be in terms of this national culture. So this one, I picked China, India, Iran, and South Korea. So some Confucian Chinese, some Confucian Asian, and then some South Asian countries, and then a kind of a Western Asian country, all right? So here, look at power distance. You can see that the difference, all right? So when we talk about power distance, the higher the score, that means the higher power distance. You have much more respect to authority or fear of authority. The lower the power distance, you feel that we are all equal, all right? So you see that for these 4 countries, there is a difference there, quite obvious. But then if you look at individualism, right? So don't say that all these Asians are very collective. It may be too generalized. So if you look at Iran and India, they are a lot more individualistic than if you are from Korea and China. And that's why the Cultural Intelligence Center kind of put all these Confucian Asian countries in a category. May not be the best or most accurate one, but at least it gives us some general idea.
But if you plugged into the United States and individualism, they would be like 98.
Yeah, right. And then in terms of masculinity, you can see that uncertainty avoidance. You see, Chinese people can live with a lot of uncertainty, but low uncertainty. So Chinese people cannot live a lot with uncertainty. Let's start over again because there's double negative. Chinese people are low in uncertainty avoidance. So they avoid uncertainty. They want more structure. They want to be able to see the future or the results. While South Korean people can live with that a lot more. You see the huge difference there. Long-term orientation, wow, right? For South Koreans, they are very long-term oriented. They don't celebrate immediate success. They look at the long term. What they do now is going to contribute to the future. While the Iran, they are much less in that area. Indulgence is kind of in the same area. The next one is I just chose another 4 countries, totally unrelated, very random, and see what it shows. Azerbaijan, Japan, Lebanon, and Thailand. Okay, just spend a moment, look at these results. And then what it comes to mind is, how does the information translate into our practice? What should we do? If we have friends from these Asian countries, how are we going to adjust our communication style how can we adjust our expectation on their appearance and behavior? How do we be more hospitable to these friends from different countries as you invite them into your conversation? Okay, so for the next 2 slides, we can look at some practice that we can imagine, we can think of, or we should consider. All right, so cultural practices. Next, please. All right, so how do we expect, and how do we adjust, and how do we embrace these differences? So you look at your own culture, your own expectation. Are you a high power distance person? And how do you work with somebody who is very low power distance? How do you adjust your expectation and behavior? Okay, so earlier Penny gave an example. If you are a professor, do people address you as professor last name? Or we are more on an equal ground? So for me, I teach at both, all the way from undergraduate degree level to doctoral level. So we have different relationships with the students. So I would say that very clearly to my students, especially for graduate level students. I would say I am on a first name basis on the very first day of class. Just call me Kait. That's just fine, okay? You don't need to call me doctor or professor or something. For undergraduate, so sometimes I have to adjust because you know that here in the United States, and we teach kids, school kids, to call teachers Mr., Mrs. last name, right? And there's something that I got a little bit uncomfortable because I was not brought up in this culture. I very seldom call somebody Mr. something and then Mrs. something, especially within like a group setting. So to me, that would be helpful to just make it very clear, right? So if I sign my name in my email to a student, Professor Chau or something, right? Or I would just sign my first name. So that will make the students know the expectation. This is how we look at power distance. But be careful that because not all Asians have the same expectation in that area because we're individuals. We are all brought up with our different history, with our different stories. So we may work a little bit differently. How do you address your pastors at church? How do you address your pastor? Do you call him or her Reverend last name? Do you call by pastor first name? You see, the culture is changing, right? The practice is changing. Just a few, like 20, 30 years ago, when I first came to North America, when I went to a conference, music conference, we all dressed up, all men, suit and tie. Ladies dressed very nicely with a dress, all right? And in the last 20, 30 years, communication became a lot more informal. So if I present it without attire, I look weird, right? But nowadays it's totally acceptable. Things are changing. So it depends on who we're working with and at what particular circumstance. How do we address individualism and collectivism situation? In your classroom setting, for example, you have group work. 5, 6 people get together, work on a project. So for those who are more individualistic, they will think my grade is important, right? I'm not concerned about the group because the group will disband after this project. It's not a bad thought, it is right? The group will disband, but my grade stays with me on my transcript, right? So no matter what, I am going to do well. If you are not contributing, I'm going to take over. I will make sure that we got a good project to hand in, and I got good grade. And then for you who are not paying the attention, you're not putting in the effort, you got the same grade as mine, I'll be very upset. Which is true because they believe that we should all share the responsibility, but if you don't, I will take over and I need to, and you don't get the grade. I deserve that grade. But if you have a group member who are more collectivistic, what happens is this person will always look at the group. How are we doing? How are we doing, right? Are we making progress? Are we behind? I want to make sure that we're on schedule so that you take your part, you do your research, you write your page, and then we all put these together, right? And then if you are on a very high individualistic side, and then you work with somebody who are on a very high collectivistic side, how do we adjust our expectation, right? It doesn't mean that we have to change ourselves. The thing is, how can we utilize our different gifts and behavior and expectation? Why don't we assign you as a more collectivist type person, always have a kind of an overview on how we are doing, okay? I am concerned about my grade. How can I be a good encourager to the group that everybody does their own work? So turning a kind of a difference into a cooperative environment. Caring versus strength. How do we look at these two dimensions, these two values, and then we work together? Any suggestions, any idea from you that you want to share? How can we work together, especially knowing students, friends, maybe from the Asian culture, they lean towards one side. For example, we are less direct, right? We are we are more formal, but we have a high context. Let me tell you a story, which is kind of dangerously political. To look at how we work with ambiguity, okay? I jokingly say that when you come to the US, there is a piece of legislation for everything in life. So I don't know there's any lawyers here that are good at every piece of law in the US. It would take a lifetime not to understand them, just to read them, right? So I don't know, how thick, this lexicon is. But because we don't want to deal with that kind of ambiguity in life, okay? If you build a deck, go check the the building code. How high, how tall, how deep, how wide, what color, everything is controlled, all right? And here we have a police chief in one of the places in Asia. And there was a lot of crackdown happening politically recently in the last few months. And this police chief in a press conference said this: for those who commit a crime, who committed a crime, you should know deep well, you are in trouble, right? You are in trouble. We will go after you. So people ask, what are the crimes? If you commit a crime, you will know. All right? And somehow that's what he said in public, right? A lot of ambiguity. Well, he was sincere. He was that, But it's like sometimes in my culture, my parents would say to me that, that's wrong. That's wrong. Your conscience will tell you that is not right, right? And then you have to react to that. But sometimes here we look at, well, this is wrong, and very specific, right? So the whole society is changing. So even though in my day-to-day life, I live in a more high context environment, but in certain professional area, I will behave very, very low context. It's very, very clear. And sometimes people laugh at me and say, Kaiton, the person who writes email in point form. So you have, point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because, I need to defend that position. So, going this way. So my professional life and my personal life could be a little bit different. But that's the reality. Last line, I think. All right. How do we live with people who has a different cultural orientation from ours? I want to say that it is not right or wrong to be individualistic or collectivistic. It is not right or wrong that you value strength or you value caring. It is not right or wrong that you indulge yourself and constantly restraining yourself. In most cases, they are not right or wrong issues, okay? The thing is, we need to recognize our differences and our similarities. Where do we find common ground? Where do we find that we have different gifts, and we have different personalities, and we have different ways to deal with life? And we also have a story, like a backstory behind us. Why am I the person who I am today? Because of a lot of backstory that mold me and bring me into a person that I am today. So how can we recognize our similarities? If I am individualistic, you are collectivistic, I need to recognize that both of us bear the image of God. God did not make all of us the same, but there are similarities. We have values, the biblical values that guide our living. Okay? If you are a high uncertainty avoidance person, it is not wrong to be a person like that. It is not wrong to be a low uncertainty avoidance person, because we share God's image. That's not the image saying that, this is the right way and that is the wrong way. It's not a sin to be on either side of the spectrum. We have to recognize that. So the similarities and difference that we have, we need to recognize. All right? So don't believe that I am always right. Okay? If I am collectivistic, you're very individualistic, and then I say that you're bad or you're wrong. That is not true. That is not true. Again, I said that a spectrum rather than dichotomy. So we are not always 100% in collectivistic, 100% individualism, or we are 100% low power distance, 100% high power distance. That's not true. It is not a dichotomy, but a spectrum. So people tend to be more high power distance or tend to be low power distance. Recognize that, and it's not black and white, always like on and off issue. And we need to practice our cultural intelligence capability. David Livermore promotes the idea that there are 4 areas, 4 capabilities to increase our cultural intelligence. We need to concern about the CQ drive, the motivation, what motivates us. So when you're in a group setting, work together, or a professor-student setting, we are working together in the same space, that drive us to understand each other better, because we have something to accomplish, right, in the classroom or in a Calvin community. CQ knowledge, how do we develop knowledge about other culture? Okay, how do they, in terms of looking at their spectrum, how do they lean towards in those dimensions? Okay, and how do we build our understanding without getting into the minefield or danger of stereotyping? Oh, all Asian people are like that. All Japanese people are like that. All Indian people are like that. So without falling into that trap, but having that understanding of individual culture, have a strategy. When you go into a situation, in a multicultural situation, when you're going to talk with somebody, work together with somebody, have some kind of a plan that you have in your head before you get into that. All right, so that you have a way to do, and you have a reference point, and then you always, when you carry out the plan, the action, do it. Do you want to talk slower? Do you want to use a more formal or informal language as you talk with this person? In terms of your timeline, if you are a very clear, definitive, high avoidance person, you want to have a very clear timeline. But the other person can live with some sort of ambiguity. All right, as long as we got that part done around that day, then we should be fine. If you are going to a situation that to you, 10 o'clock is 10 o'clock. If the meeting starts at 10, okay, it starts at 10. If you come in at 10:01, we all look at you, right? And then if it ends at 11:30, it ends at 11:30. Pastor, come on, get it done. I have something else to do on Sunday. So you are a high uncertainty avoidance person. But for some different culture, we talk about African American culture, right? So they come in at a different time. And then the service can last a lot longer than the published schedule. That is part of their culture. So as we work with people, is punctuality a value that you want to keep? All right? Somebody who comes in late, early, and ends late or early, is that because of a bad habit? Or is that because of their cultural background? We don't get out until we got the discussion finished. But somebody will say, no, because I have something else that happens in 2:30. I need to get out right in that moment, right? So we need to understand each other and turn that into action. And of course, we need to have that loving one another, right? You are different than me, but I still love you, all right? Because we all have God's image, and God loves us all. Why don't we learn how to love each other and live with each other, understanding that we all have different gifts and orientation? And the second last thing is to look at cultural behavior from our viewpoint. Sometimes it's helpful, but sometimes it's dangerous. In cultural studies, we understand that things are relative. So Aaron Meyer had a very famous example saying that, to the English people, right? The Indian people don't have a very strict schedule. They can live with a lot of ambiguity. And the British people tend to have a more strict plan. So they think that the Indian people are more high context and low uncertainty avoidance and something like that. But then if a British person was talking with a German person, maybe the German person would think the British people are so unorganized, right? Simply because they are looking at the other culture from their viewpoint. So we want to be careful that when we look at different culture, it's not the absolute that you are such an individualistic person. Well, basically, you are more individualistic than I am. If you look at another person, maybe that person even more individualistic. Looking at that person, no, he's not, or she's not, right? So the viewpoint will change, depends on who you are, from which point of view. That's important. And the last thing I would say, practice hospitality. We are all different. We have all different culture. We have our own history with our people, right? I came to the U.S. and lived here about 12 years ago. And then I felt that, the racial tension is really, really high in this country. Anything you bring up this racial thing, everybody's blood is boiling, right? And it goes to that level. Compared to Canada, I lived there for 20 years. And the racial tension is different, right? They have their own issues to deal with, but this is not as high. So the thing is, as you move into different community, how do we practice hospitality? How do we display hospitality? A biblical term literally means a love of stranger, right? How do you make them feel that it's home for them? So when I came into this country welcomed me. I felt like home. And how do I make my space, classroom space, church space, or some other space, be a welcoming community to people who are different than me?
All right, so we just have a couple minutes, and I want to give you some resources to take with you. So if you were to go to this website, you could find information about the Diversity and Inclusion for All project of Calvin University. And this taps diversity and inclusion work that's being done in a whole bunch of different places on campus, not just the social work department, for example, but also in philosophy and history and English and SPOD and just all over in different areas. And it highlights those and takes expertise and taps into those people and the staff and faculty and puts together resources to help us all learn and unlearn in good ways. Part of that project is a podcast that's new, the Diversity Inclusion for All podcast of Calvin University. And that podcast has now 32 episodes. Just want to say that was my summer. But we have a range of topics, including things like this, something on land acknowledgement, identities, race, and social constructs, what is a good American, unconscious bias, microaggressions, and stereotype threat, I would definitely recommend. We have other topics like disability as diversity, and we have here Asians in America, the stories we tell. In fact, there are 3 specific episodes that I wanted to highlight that are looking at Asians in America that may be of interest to your group since you're here today for this topic. And it's episodes 15, 16, and 17 on these different topics. And an episode is between like 20 and 35 minutes. They're kind of different, but they're not like an hour-long commitment. And as podcasts go, you can download it, and then you can go for your run, or you can garden or wash dishes or walk the dog. So there are also some subset series inside of the podcast already. So there are, I think, over 20 episodes on race in America, and Eric Washington and Michelle were both involved in some of those. And then there are 8 different episodes that are related to interfaith engagement and an introduction to Islam. So if those 2 areas are interested, you could just focus in on those different ones. And a couple other resources I wanted to make you aware of, and maybe you already know this, but on Calvin's campus, we do have 2 student orgs or clubs that are specifically designed to be connection and welcoming spaces, but they are not exclusive. So it's not like anybody in this room couldn't become involved in one of these, right? But there is an Asian American Association, and they have a Facebook page, and they're pretty active, and you can check them out. And their advisor mentors are Jane Brune and Beulah Joy Kang, both in the CISD. And then there's also specifically a Chinese student organization, and their faculty mentor is Anding Shen, whom you can see here. So if you're interested in either of those, you can actually just Google them, and you'll get a Calvin page, and you can see like who's the president or the chair or director, whatever, and contact them if you're interested in any information. And I know that the different ones have different events throughout the year, so you can be looking for those too in student news. And then I wanted to remind our faculty and staff, if you haven't already done this because you were sitting there doing it on your phone while someone was talking, to record this event as a cross-cultural professional development event for the year by going to the Human Resources page and clicking on Cultural Competency. Thank you so much for coming. We do have a few minutes. I know some people have to run to a thing, and I just thank you for your patience. You've been a great audience. But if you have any questions, we do have a couple minutes, or you can venture out into the grayness and take your learning with you.
I have a question that it could be for any of y'all, but it pertains to code switching and looking at the spectrum of those things that we had to mark down, the numbers and everything. And I just be honest, code switching is like a daily part of my life, especially here. So I just want you to open up on that. So yeah, obviously I'm on high contact. So just whatever y'all have to say about the code switching element in spaces like this, because even though I'm born and raised in the United States, but I'm not majority culture.
So can you pick that up, or should I repeat it? I got it. Okay. So the question is about code switching, and you probably have so many stories you could tell, because I think you live that too, in some pretty significant ways. Do you want to?
Code switching. Okay? We need to ask ourselves, why do we do that, right? Because what we are thinking of is we want to either build relationship, the interpersonal relationship. We have a mission to accomplish. We have something that we need to complete, right? And the idea is, as we move into different environment, we work with different people with different cultural orientation. How do we adjust, and how do we raise expectation? So for me, my wife and I from Asia, very Confucian Asian, right? And then our kids are born in Canada, raised in Canada, and now in the US. So their cultural expectation is very different than my wife and my own, right? And how do we adjust the expectation, right? So I cannot expect them to treat me as a parent as I treat my parents. I cannot expect that, when I was a little kid, when a teacher walked by, we step aside and let them walk. That is the cultural expectation. So you don't go face to face with the teacher, right? You just swear by, all right? And that does not happen here. If you say this to our kids, they look at you like a monster, right? You're from the moon or from Jupiter or something, right? So that's not the part of the cultural upbringing. On the one side, we lament that the loss of our traditional value, use that term, been in a pretty heavy way. But then on the other side is why, right? Why do we expect them to behave like that in a different society altogether, right? So, and then we from a more high context culture. So my wife and I, sometimes we don't say things that explicitly, right? We kind of, expect that she understands me and I understand her. But then to the kids, they will say, why are you beating around the bush, right? Just say it. If I'm wrong, just tell me I'm wrong, right? Or you tell me that I'm crazy or something. But, well, in my culture, we don't say that you are crazy, right? It is just very, very impolite even to a kid to say like that. So that's the thing that we have to constantly, be aware of and adjust as necessary. So that brings up one of the points that Penny write in her book, the core, the negotiable, and the additional. So what considers our core? As a person, we need to love each other. It doesn't say that, because I don't want to love you, I can just, there are certain things that forms ourselves. As a Christian, as a person, what are the values that you keep close to your heart you will not change? What are the negotiable that now that we live in this society, we can, adjust ourselves? Or something is, in Penny's term, additional. Those are the things that are less important. You can go either way to benefit the entire situation or the mission you want to accomplish.
We could talk a lot about that. But I think in terms of back to code switching, I think it's important too, because some people will say, well, you are at Calvin University, just deal with it. This is how we do things here. If you want to succeed, you got to do it this way. And to some extent that's true, but I think most of the people who are still here, they know how to do that. They are code switching, right? And the question is, can we, in the majority culture, can we just be more aware of the code switching that is the success that these people, that we have for people who are code switching all the time, right? And that just takes effort. It's like the extra effort of every day. And we just need to recognize that. And then can we get a little bit more knowledge about cultural differences? Can we get a little more willingness to be culturally flexible, right? To say, you know what? We're going to create some space. I have control over a space or a conversation or a meeting or a conference. I'm going to create some opportunities in there for people with other conflict and conversation styles, right? Indirect, direct. I'm going to create other ways to let communication happen that aren't always the Calvin University majority culture US way, right? And it doesn't have to be all the time, but there could be spaces, right, where you specifically try to do that. And people will notice, like I can totally function in I'm going to say a masculine university space. I can tell you at the beginning of this talk, these are our learning points. And then I could have at the end said, by the way, we did this, 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 and this. But I could also create a space where it's much more open and free-flowing. And then that doesn't have to be every space, right? That's a little less agenda-driven. And that doesn't mean it's less efficient or less productive. And we need to recognize that too, right? An emotional response is not an invalid one, right? An agendaless meeting is not necessarily unproductive. And we don't create those spaces quite enough with the other spaces that aren't usual universities. And we just need to think about how can we do that to make other people with other communication styles. And really Asians have a lot of Asians and Asian culture people have are coming from very different cultural and communication styles. And they are successful here. I'm not saying they're not. And I'm not saying that people from other cultures shouldn't learn to be successful in those ways or learn to code switch. But we can be more welcoming and more loving and more embracing and make people feel a sense of belonging if we also create spaces that recognize some of these communication and cultural differences. So, I don't want to keep you any longer. We're happy to stay a couple minutes if people have questions, but thank you so much for staying to the end. Have a great day and continue to enjoy Unlearn Week. And tell your neighbors and friends that these will be archived eventually, and you can find them on Calvin Vimeo or Calvin YouTube channel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.